So this week we're discussing Peter Pan, specifically the musical version for Mary Martin, produced by NBC in 2014. Now, theoretically I specialize in lesbian media, and thus far, granted it's only been 2 episodes, but still, I have only reviewed movies with explicitly lesbian main characters. But that's slim pickings, even compared to media focused on gay men.
Keep it gay, keep it gay, keep it gay.
So, does something need to have explicitly lesbian characters to qualify as lesbian media?
Keep it gay, keep it gay, keep it gay.
So, I started writing this with just information I could find on the internet, and I wasn't really making a distinction between LGBT and queer as distinct words and identities because I'm writing a video for my own amusement, not for a college essay. But words matter, right? Media matters. Part of my interest in media is how it shapes our worldview and how that can affect us. So I was reading this to sort of supplement and confirm my research, and because Harry Benshoff is awesome, guys, check out his other work. And the intro has this section in it with the distinctions between gay and queer, and how gay post-World War II up until the 1970s had a similar definition to what queer means now, and how that got pushed to the side to further the cause of gay essentialism, or born this way, and how that pushed bisexual and transgender people to the side, and ended up splitting up gay men and lesbians into 2 distinct groups. So it seems kind of disingenuous to define something as LGBT when I mean queer and vice versa. It especially seems disingenuous to define something as queer when I actually mean gay, and specifically for gay men, all things considered. So if LGBT and queer are distinct concepts, then LGBT media and queer media must be as well. By and large, media watchdogs like GLAAD and LGBT Fans Deserve Better tend to focus on specifically LGBT media, which they define as explicit depictions of LGBT characters and/or issues. So defining LGBT media is pretty simple, but queer is a slur turned academic term, and it's generally considered broader than LGBT. So academia, which frequently focuses on queer media, tends to define something as queer or not queer on a case-by-case basis without a unified definition. So, is personal perception the only thing marking media as queer or not queer? I started by asking some friends, mostly not straight, with one straight ally for variety, and because she's the only person I know with a media studies degree. And here's what I got out of those definitions. Media connected in some way to the LGBT community, normally by featuring LGBT characters or issues. I find this definition kind of limiting. For one thing, I explicitly asked for queer rather than LGBT, and got a lot of answers back using LGBT. Like me, a lot of people use the terms interchangeably. But also, that would exclude anything made during the Hays Code, even things like Suddenly Last Summer and Dracula's Daughter. Side note, if you haven't seen Dracula's Daughter, check it out, it's awesome.
Do you like jewels, Lily? This is very old and very beautiful. Please don't come any closer.
There's precious little queer media as it is. It seems a waste to discount anything. Thankfully, I have academia on my side. Most academics define things on a case-by-case basis, but Harry Benshoff and Sean Griffin defined guidelines for queer media in Queer Cinema, the Film Reader, which I mentioned earlier. They enumerate 3 general criteria for defining a piece of media as queer. The first criteria is auteur or creative force. Was this created by people who are LGBT? Now, personally, I have issues with Auteur Theory, which focuses on directors and requires an extended body of work, but for today's video, we'll focus on defining auteur as driving creative forces. If you'd like to know more about Auteur Theory and specifically the issues with it, I'll put some links in the description. So, if we're defining auteur as a driving creative force, we can look at some examples without me frothing at the mouth. For instance, John Waters has never done a straight thing in his entire life. Even his family-friendly movies, Hairspray, it's just Hairspray, are coming from the mind of a man who is unapologetically queer, often collaborating with other queer people. Bryan Singer took the X-Men from a fairly ham-fisted race allegory to a surprisingly apt gay allegory.
So, when did you first know you were
a mutant?
And Beauty and the Beast was Howard Ashman's final movie as he died of AIDS, and it focuses on looking past what society considers monstrous and making those definitions for yourself. Criteria 2 is aesthetic form or camp. Is this using queer style? Does it focus on queer issues? And is it using camp? Hocus Pocus doesn't have any queer characters, but it certainly leads into camp.
I put a spell on you. And now you're mine.
And has actresses that are considered divas to the gay male community. The idolization of divas by gay men and gay male misogyny is a conversation for another time. The Little Mermaid bases the design of its villain off of a well-known drag queen, Divine. The third criteria is reception or self-determination. Have queer people embraced it as their own? Look at The Wizard of Oz. It's a movie that predates and defines several pieces of contemporary queer culture. Gay men used to self-identify as friends of Dorothy to the point that the US government started searching for this mythical Dorothy, and Somewhere Over the Rainbow is frequently considered a queer anthem. Despite that, the key word in their qualifications is that it might be. Not all of these things are queer media. Ursula was based on a drag queen, but The Little Mermaid doesn't validate her as a character. She's the villain, a habit Disney can't seem to break.
How they squirm when they see how I glitter.
There's one thing missing from this, and it's the only part of the LGBT media definition. Queer characters. Rent was written by Jonathan Larson, a straight man, and none of the queer characters was played by a queer person in the original Broadway cast. I don't know that anyone would consider it not a piece of queer media, though. I assume they considered number 2 sufficient to cover this aspect, so we'll gloss over it for now. However, something fits all three, I feel like I can safely call it a piece of queer media. So, where does Peter Pan fit into all of this? Well, for starters, there's a dozen different adaptations of Peter Pan, and not all are created equal. Disney's Peter Pan fulfills none of the requirements for queer media, for instance. Meanwhile, Lost Boy, by Sassafras Lowry, is an entirely queer retelling of Peter Pan, to the point where Peter is genderless, all the Lost Boys are butch women and tomboys, and the pirates are leather daddies. So, where does the Mary Martin musical and its various revivals fall? Well, it certainly got no textual queer characters, so let's look at those 3 criteria from earlier. Criteria 1, queer auteur. So, here's what we know. Mary Martin was the primary creative force behind this Peter Pan adaptation. She was in charge of choosing the creative team, and by some accounts had been trying to make a production of Peter Pan to star in a full decade before the 1954 Broadway premiere. Her husband, Richard Halliday, was as openly gay as you could be in the 50s, and rumors persisted throughout her career that she was having affairs with women, notably Jean Arthur, another Peter Pan, and Janet Gaynor. If nothing else, she identified with Peter Pan beyond any other character she played. As for the 2014 version of the show, I'm not sure there was enough creative vision for there to be a primary driving creative force. It's such a safe choice that I can't see anyone arguing for it out of creative passion. I mean, it's been adapted for TV 5 times now. Criteria 2. Queer form and aesthetic. Obviously, Peter Pan is played by a woman, and Mary Martin's costume from the 1960 teleplay informed lesbian aesthetics for decades after. Peter's costume in the 2014 production looks like it came from my friend's closet. They've replaced all the leaves from Kathy Rigby's costume with mesh and leather strapping. Meanwhile, Hook is a camp character born of the dame in British pantos, female characters played by male comic actors in drag, not dissimilar to Mrs. Trunchbull in Matilda the Musical.
In my school?
So even as Christopher Walken is technically a man playing a male part, the source of the character is rooted in drag. Also, he and his pirates literally all do a tango together. Criteria 3. Being embraced by the queer community. I mean, as far as I can tell, this was more a thing before 2003's Peter Pan with its age and gender accurate casting. Still, there are books about Mary Martin as Peter Pan and her influence on lesbian self-identity and aesthetic. And looking at lesbian websites, the 2014 production was definitely a point of interest for people. So, technically that's 3 out of 3. Now, obviously I'm not expecting everyone to agree with me, and I know I'm reaching a little, but I do think it's important to open up our definition of queer media, especially when we're looking at something written in the 1950s. Although, my tagline is lesbian musicals and only lesbian musicals, so I've technically failed, and somehow that doesn't bother me that much. Peter Pan's just really queer.